The 2023 draft class is absolutely stacked, at least with the very top end talent. And I have no doubt that there are going to be many teams that are going to try and tank seriously hard to try and win the first overall pick. And of course, Connor Bedard, who absolutely will very, very likely be the guy going first overall, barring some catastrophic situation that happens this upcoming season. In this video, I'm going to be basically ranking every team and how likely they are to be winning the Connor Bedard sweepstakes. So if that sounds good to you guys, please be sure to stick around to the end of the video to see where your favorite team will end up on this list. So I am going to be doing this tier list from least likely to most likely team to win the first overall pick. So of course, starting off in our lowest tier, I guess, we have the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Florida Panthers. And quite simply, these teams are in this tier because they don't have any first round picks. They do not have their own first round picks, nor do they have another team's first in 2023. So these teams, no matter how bad they are at this point in time, literally have no chance of winning the first overall selection. Now, the next tier I have here are the contenders. Now, these are just teams, in my opinion, that I think are basically the top teams in the league and are the most likely to go on deep playoff runs. But all these teams do retain their first round picks in 2023 for now. So theoretically, even if they have a disastrous season, perhaps a ton of injuries, and these teams don't make the playoffs and they become a lottery team, there is theoretically a chance that any of these teams could win the first overall pick, but in my view, it is extremely unlikely. Now, these teams are, of course, the Colorado Avalanche, the Carolina Hurricanes, the Edmonton Oilers, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the New York Rangers. All these teams, I think, should be at the very least locks to make the playoffs. I think if there's any team in this tier that maybe could go down a tier, it is the Rangers, because ultimately I don't think the actual team in front of their goalie, Shesterkin, was really that great this season. But I expect them to be a little bit better, and if Shesterkin can put up another season like he did this last one, or even somewhat similar, they should at the very least be making the playoffs. So these teams should not, at any consideration, really be lottery teams. This next tier teams are teams that I think are reasonable bets to make the playoffs, and they are the Dallas Stars, the Calgary Flames, St. Louis Blues, the Vegas Golden Knights, the Washington Capitals, Pittsburgh Penguins, Boston Bruins, and the LA Kings. All of these teams I think are pretty reasonable bets to make the playoffs. So there is definitely a chance that some of these teams don't make the playoffs. Pittsburgh, Washington, Boston, and LA in particular are four teams that I'm not 100% sold on, but especially with LA, like the Pacific Division in general is pretty bad, so they really should make the playoffs. With the Capitals, Pens, and Bruins, they're all kind of going in the direction that I think for long-term success, maybe not the way to go, but especially with like the Penguins, but they should probably at least make the playoffs again this year. The Bruins supposedly are getting Krejci back, so that kind of fills their biggest need in terms of a number two center, assuming he plays that role again for them. So I think they should probably be a playoff team as well. And the Capitals really only have Darcy Kemper in goal, who I'm not 100% sold on, but if he can play more like the second half he had in the regular season with the Avalanche this past season, they should absolutely make the playoffs. I wouldn't be completely surprised if a number of these teams didn't make the playoffs, but even if these caliber teams don't make the playoffs, I don't think they're quite going to be in the lottery contention either. They're probably going to be drafting somewhere between like 13 and 16 in the draft. And with the new lottery rules, you can only move up 10 spots. So if you're drafting 13th overall and you win, you can only go up to 3rd overall, and that is not going to get you Connor Bedard. So these teams in general are still quite unlikely to win the Connor Bedard sweepstakes. Okay, this next year is where things start to get pretty interesting because there's going to be a lot of variation with these teams when it comes to the standings next season. And but I think you can make a reasonable argument that any one of these teams could potentially make the playoffs. Some of them I think are a bit more likely than others, but none of them at this point in time truly stand out as definitive lottery teams for me. A lot of these teams probably will start selling off around the trade deadline and really jump into that lottery team status, especially if they're having particularly poor regular seasons up until that point. But for now, I think, again, any of these teams could potentially make the playoffs. I mean, you look at Vancouver, as long as they have JT Miller on their team, they should probably actually make the playoffs, especially in a weak Pacific Division. But who knows if he's actually going to be on the team or not? It sounds like they're trying to trade him. If they do, then that probably bumps them a little closer to lottery team than bubble team for me. But I still like their core in general. They could potentially improve this season and make a push for a playoff spot. Seattle, probably one of the teams in this tier that's closer to a lottery team than a playoff team. But with the addition of Shane Wright, you never know. They could be something a little interesting, at least again, especially in a weak Pacific Division. Columbus, with the addition of Johnny Gaudreau, is certainly interesting. They could be better than expected. Detroit, with all the additions they made, I think is at this point kind of ready to make a serious push for the playoffs this season. The Islanders probably should be a playoff team, but they had such a bad season this past season. It's kind of hard to judge them. Of course, they did have that crazy long road trip to start the season. But in general, like, I think they're definitely closer to playoff than lottery team, but they're a team that I'm going to want to see a few games from them before I really cement them as playoff status. The Wild, I think, are probably going to be worse this season than they were last season with the loss of Kevin Fiala, but I definitely don't think they're contender status at all, but I do think they probably should make the playoffs, but I'm not completely sold on them. The Sharks are a team that's probably closer to the lottery than playoff status, but again, a weak Pacific Division, and I don't know, some of the moves they made, they definitely have more stuff to do this offseason. Unloading Burns, making Carlson the true number one defenseman. If he can stay healthy all season, play 82 games, like the Sharks are not that bad of a team with Erik Karlsson on them. If the problem is he's been playing between like 40 and 60 games every year they've had him. But if they can get a full 82 games out of Erik Karlsson, and they can get improved goaltending. Now, their goaltending this last season was greatly improved over the Jones era. However, it still wasn't that fantastic. They rode Reimer pretty hard at the end of the season as well, and he's a guy that's likely going to be traded at some point. But if one of Aiden Hill or Kaapo Kakkonen can really step up, and I will say this, Kakkonen did play well for them this last season, even though his record did not reflect that. Uh, they have an outside shot at making the playoffs. That being said, they probably should be going in the lottery direction, and I suspect they will be sellers at the trade deadline. Winnipeg is another weird team. They're kind of in a weird place in general right now with wanting to trade Dubois, some of the moves they've made in recent years, but overall, I still don't think they're that far out of the playoffs. I mean, it wasn't that long ago they made the Western Conference final. I believe it was, anyways. But yeah, they're one of the teams again. I think is slightly less likely to make the playoffs. I think they're better than a team like the Sharks, but they're definitely not as interesting, at least, as a team like Vancouver. I don't know. They're a tough read for me. Next, you have the Senators. They're a team that I think stands to improve a lot this season. They could definitely be a dark horse for the playoffs. Same thing kind of for Buffalo. With the Predators, they're a team that's kind of on the decline, but they're still in the playoff race for sure, especially that they've re-signed Forsberg. I was kind of expecting him to walk and the team to definitely go in a tanking direction, but they haven't done that. So they're going to fight for a playoff spot at least. And ultimately, I think they probably miss the playoffs, but I don't think they're going to be bad enough to really be in the lottery, at least not in the bottom 10 teams of the league. So I don't think they're going to have a fantastic chance at winning Connor Bedard. Finally, in this tier, I have the New Jersey Devils. They're another interesting team that I think is on the upswing. There was a lot of rumors that they were going to land Johnny Gaudreau. Of course, they ended up not landing him, but even without him, if they can get improved goaltending, I think they're a dark horse for the playoffs. At the very least, I don't quite see them being bottom 10. And if they are bottom 10 in the league, they'll probably be like 9th or 10th. So even then, their odds aren't going to be great to win the first overall pick, but it's definitely a possibility. Finally, I have 5 teams that at this point in the offseason at least are definitely bona fide lottery teams, in my opinion. And those are the Anaheim Ducks, the Arizona Coyotes, the Chicago Blackhawks, the Montreal Canadiens, and the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, the Flyers are kind of different from these other teams in that they appeared as though they are still trying to be competitive and make the playoffs. But quite frankly, the moves that they've made, I just don't see it. Their defense is absolutely terrible, and I don't see their goaltending really bailing them out that often. Definitely not often enough for them to make a significant playoff push. I don't know. The other 4 teams in this tier are kind of looking like dedicated tank jobs this season, especially Arizona, Chicago, and Montreal. Anaheim is a little bit different. They had a pretty good start to last season, but they fell off pretty hard in the second half. And again, in a weak Pacific Division, maybe they win enough games that by the end of the season, they're not like bottom 5 in the league. Maybe they're like 7th or 8th, and their odds of winning first overall are not the greatest. I definitely think teams like Arizona, Chicago, or Montreal are the 3 favorites, and Anaheim is definitely like a notch below them, but there's still a team that should be thinking about the lottery from the onset of the season. So unless something really surprises with them early in the season, I think they're going to go in that direction, and they're going to try to make themselves worse as the season goes along, selling off some veteran guys perhaps, and we will see. They're definitely in the running for the Bedard sweepstakes. If you thought this video deserved a like, please do give it a like. That really helps me out. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to stick around to watch another video, I will put one on screen for you now.